All right, this is Tom and Byron from wealthmoney.org, and today we're going to talk about what's going on in the American economy, and we'll kind of let Byron get into that and why everybody's having such a tough time.
Well, it's pretty obvious why everybody's having a tough time. I mean, everybody I know talks about, the shortage of money and not having enough money to do what they want, and everybody I know is trying to get more money, and I like to get back to what got me into this in the first place. How in the world, and I went through this with a couple of guys the other day, and just tell me, everybody that you know works trying to gain a profit, every company you know and everything else. Well, if we're all doing that, how come collectively get deeper and deeper in debt? And that's the thing that you really have to dwell on if you're ever going to get down to the root of the problem. Glenn Beck's talking about, restoring my honor. Well, I don't think I ever lost my honor. I don't know what I did to do it. I've always tried to be honest, and I've always tried to do, what's right, and that's what got me into this thing in the first place, was trying to understand just why things work, that people who produced so much had such a hard time, and people who sat on their duff in an office had just unlimited amounts of money to loan, it seemed like. And so, being a man that kind of likes to understand things when it bothers me and do some research, as you all know, I wrote some letters to the Treasury, and they told me very clearly that 100% of the money is created as interest-bearing debt. All money is created when somebody goes into debt, and then they tell you, nobody ever mentions it, that also that money is extinguished if you get out of debt. So we have all these politicians running around telling us, well, we got to either spend more, they don't tell you that we got to borrow it to spend it, or we got to cut our taxes like heck and cut spending, well, and get out of debt. And they don't tell you that, wait a minute, if you get out of debt, you extinguish your money supply, so then money will get even shorter. So in order to solve all these problems, we have to get down to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is very simple. 100% of your money is created as interest-bearing loans by the bankers. And of course, they do this very subtly because, well, if you need a little money, come on in, and I can get you a little loan. And so to get that loan, you have to go in and you have to sign a promissory note. And the bank takes that promissory note and puts it on a book as an asset to itself and a liability to you. Then it takes that same amount of money that you promised to pay, that same number, and enters into your checking account as a liability to the bank and an asset to you. See, that proves right there that they never actually paid you anything because they still owe you. But then they don't, when you sign the promissory note, you have to pay interest on that. When they create that money and put it in your checking account, they don't pay you interest on that. So now, right away, their assets are growing with time and your debts are growing with time. And then we have to think about all the power that gives the banking system. Because now they have the absolute ability to decide who gets money and who doesn't get money, and who basically can get money to succeed in a business. And if they don't like you, then they can say no loans. And then it's pretty tough for you to get the capital to get going. And another thing, we talk about a capitalistic system, and we don't have one. We have a monopolistic capitalism system where the monopoly, the banking system, controls 100% of the capital. And we only basically rent it. They call it interest, but we actually rent it. So now we have to rent all the money from them all the time. Well, it's even worse than that, because with interest, if you don't pay it, and you have a mortgage on your property, which they give, because that's what you end up basically signing or giving them a promissory note, promising that you'll either give them the stuff or give them your assets, your house, your car, whatever things you might have. And so if you just paid your rent, well, you might have to move out and not go without it. But if you don't pay your interest, then they have the right to come in and take everything you have. And most people see this the most evidently in foreclosures. Because if they foreclose, you lose your house. And then the bank has the house, and, now wait a minute, it bought it by just giving a promise to pay. It didn't have anything when it started. It didn't loan you anything except simply turns your debt into money that you could spend for their benefit. And of course, you do get purchasing power when you borrow that money, because you can go out and buy things. But what they fail to ever tell you is you don't get ownership rights, because you still owe for it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, you don't really have ownership of it. Somebody else has ownership of it. And Russell Monk put it very well in his personal letter to me when he said the bankers own all the money all the time, and the customers merely borrow it.
You know,
and you got to pay interest on it all the time too.
And with that, I know I've kind of told you a story, but I want some other people to hear about it. You know, I'm kind of fixing up a house I got, and was over at one of the local industrial supplies, and there's a lady that works there. She travels around to go to all the different contracting sites, and she showed up at my house, and of course, somehow the conversation turned to money with her.
The conversation always turned to money, but when you and I talk to somebody, sooner or later, it always gets to money.
Pretty much, but I invited her in, and we talked for about a half hour on the money, and I just asked her, well, you know, you ever really thought about money and monetary policy? And she looked at me and said, no, and we got to talk, and she said, but geez, it's really tough out there for these guys. She said she's never seen it as bad as it is now. And I was kind of curious, and I asked her a couple questions, and she says she has contractors coming into her place, I mean, just on the verge of tears, and every job site she goes to, all she hears is all these guys are just nervous that they don't even know what they're going to be doing next week for work.
Yeah, and a lot of them ain't even sure they're going to get paid for the work after they do it.
That's true. But anyways, we went through it, and I said, well, you ever wonder how money's created? And she kind of looked at me real strange, and so I opened up Tales from the Treasury, and I read through there where Russell Monk said the actual creation of money always involves the extension of credit by private commercial banks.
Now, we want to add here, Tommy, this Tales from the Treasury is a book that I wrote. It's nothing but hardly a compilation of letters that I wrote, and Greg Soderberg wrote to the United States Treasury, and their answers back to us. And that's what you opened up and showed you the actual letter from Russell Monk explaining exactly what you're saying. Go ahead.
And then we went through that, and I asked her, well, every time you've got an extension of credit, you had to borrow it and do what? And she said, well, I had to pay interest on it. And I said, okay, well, now where's the money come from to pay the interest on it? She just looked at me. She didn't know what to think. But hey, she's a nice lady, and we went through it, and we just went back, and I just showed her where Russell Monk said, hey, the money for paying interest comes from the same source as the other money comes from. You got to borrow that. That means you got to go back to the bank and borrow that too. And at that point in time, she could see something was wrong. But then when I went to the one part where John B. Henderson said money is created when loans are issued and debts incurred, but then the money is extinguished when the loans were paid, she just went, oh man. And she didn't know what to think, and she was just, oh geez. And then I kind of showed her, we talked about this, and this was probably a month and a half ago. And I seen her about 2 weeks ago. And we really got into a good conversation about this. And I seen her about 2 weeks ago, and she said, I couldn't sleep last night. And I said, oh, well, because she was pretty tired at her work, and she said, no, you don't understand. I couldn't sleep last night. I was up from 1:30 to 3:30. I just couldn't sleep. All I've been thinking about is this money. And, it's real interesting because she's one of the few people who actually could understand that it's all borrowed. And for some reason, most people just can't get that. And
then to understand the consequences of that is really the important thing, because once you understand all money is created as loans, then you have to understand the consequences of that. And once you do that, then you really, truly begin to understand what's going wrong with our economy, and where our whole nation's headed and why it's headed that way, and who's pushing it that way. Glenn Beck likes to say, first they nudge you a little, and then they push you, and then they might shoot you. But what he don't understand, he's not dealing with the people who's actually doing the real pushing, because everything I know of to get done has to be paid for. We couldn't be on this right now on this Skype unless we paid for it and got the equipment to do it, could we?
Correct.
Okay, so then if everybody's got to pay for it, somebody's got to come up with all that money. And who could do that better than the people who can create all the money and get interest on 100% of it? And just think of how much that can be. I mean, I can tell you for a fact that people borrowed money on their house for 30 years and paid over twice the amount they borrowed and still owed a lot of money on their house.
That's true.
So now, wait a minute. Think of the consequences of that, and who's got all this money to do all this creating and molding society to go the way they want it to go. Got to be the banking system, financial system.
That's funny. My neighbor, who's just about done with his PhD, he was walking down the street the other day, and we got to talking about the money, and we went through it, and he said, well, the government creates it all. And I said, well, I don't think that's true. I got a letter from him saying the banks create it all. They don't do any of it. And he goes, well, they print it. I said, well, yeah, they do a print job for the banks, but, they just do it at the cost of printing.
You also got a letter to prove that, too, don't you?
Right? Oh, yeah, I showed that to him.
Gravy.
But he seemed like an unusually intelligent guy, and I really mean that. I could tell he was sharp. And it was real funny because we went through it. He finally seen that, yeah, banks create money to do as an interest-bearing loan. But then when I showed him where the money is extinguished, he screamed so loud, I bet you could have heard him for 2 or 3 blocks around. I mean, he just, ah! But,
Yeah.
it just goes to show you, this stuff ain't taught to anybody. But then he looked over at me and he said, man, that's got to be the way it works.
It has to be. Common sense says it can't be any other way. Plus that's what the Federal Reserve System tells you it works. That's how the Treasury tells you it works. That's how the banks tell you it works. And not all your local bankers, because that's not true. But, yeah, I mean, you get up and you get the Federal Reserve purposes and function. It tells you right out that banks create everything. They buy everything they get with a promise to pay. And, I don't know, but I think if you and I could buy everything we wanted with a promise to pay that we never had to pay, I guess that just pretty much gives us everything for nothing, doesn't it?
Pretty much. I'd get it all for free.
If you get everything for free and everybody else has to borrow from you and pay you interest to have the possession of anything, man, that sounds to me like you got the leg up on everybody else, don't it?
Sure does.
And that's exactly what's going on. And most everybody seems to be afraid to talk about it, or they simply have never stopped and think about how this would really work. And economists, they seem to be the worst of all, because they have all their mathematical theories, and it always tickles me so, because you read one of the economics books, and you get into all this lines and lines of mathematical formulas. And I have a brother-in-law that's really, really he's older now, but when he was younger, he bordered on being a mathematical genius. And I've had him and other people tell me that they could actually do the math and prove that an elephant and a fly could weigh the same thing. Which pretty much gets down to the point is, figures may not lie, but liars can figure. And liars can manipulate those numbers to make them do what they want them to do. And see, this is it. Let's just deal with this in common sense language that everybody can see and understand, and see it from their own personal experiences. And that's what we've done. And, you had a story. There's a guy that I know that's a vendor, and he delivers products to Target. And I happened to get to know him, and we finally one time kind of get into this money pretty good. He kind of seemed to say it. He stopped me the other day, and he said, man, Byron, I haven't seen you for a while, but man, you're really right. We are really slaves to this economic system, aren't we? So see, he got it very clearly. It took him maybe a week or two to think about it in between times, and that's what so many of us get discouraged, but we can tell them and they don't see it right away. But we don't know how much they think about it after that. And then another guy told me that, Byron, when I first heard you, I thought, you just can't be right. But he said, I find myself, every time I pick up a cup of coffee or something, I'm thinking about this. And he says, it just gets to be that it just can't be any other way but exactly to say the way you say it works. And of course, I say it works this way because that's how the banks and the Treasury and the Federal Reserve System has told me it works. So I believe them, and plus that, my whole life of personal experiences point to the fact that this has to be true. It has to work this way, or things wouldn't be working the way they are. Because you can't get constantly deeper and deeper in debt when you're producing wealth, and especially with an agricultural background, most of that wealth come right out of the ground every year when the spring rains came and the sun warmed up and this growth began to happen. And then you have that, you turn cows out on it and they get fat and they reproduce and you have more wealth all the time. But wait a minute, we're collectively getting deeper in debt when everybody's producing wealth. They're taking and adding labor to it and turning it into something that adds value to that raw resources, and they're still getting deeper in debt collectively. Now, a few aren't, but the bulk of the people are, so it couldn't possibly work any other way.
Well, I think that'll be about good for this one, so it's our first one, so we'll see how it goes, and we'll get better.
I think we need to do this when we get to thinking about this, and we'll probably repeat ourselves quite a little bit, because this is how important it is to understand the basis of a monetary system. Until you understand the very basis of this, you will never understand what's going wrong in this country and who and what's driving it to go wrong. With that, we'll talk to you later. Have a good day, Tommy.
Yep.